All right. Well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be interviewing Dr. Crespi about his project, looking at neuroscience differences, religiosity differences between schizotypal individuals and people with autism spectrum disorder, the implications of those contrasts for our understanding of how the brain might enable different forms of religiosity. So, Dr. Crespi, could you start off just giving us an idea of the hypothesis you'll be testing, entertaining, design of your study, the theoretical background?
Right. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here. The work is focused around using cognitive variation in typical people in social cognition. So people on the autism spectrum tend to have underdeveloped social cognition, and then people with what we can call positive schizotypy, who are a little bit in the direction towards schizophrenia, have a relatively high level of sort of psychosis-related traits, forms of relatively mild reality distortion. So we have a spectrum between people with autism traits and typical people, and then positively schizotypal people, with regard to really what I see as the central feature of what has made humans human is their social cognition. And this links in directly to religiosity, in that many of the aspects of human religiosity appear to flow from aspects of social cognition. So the main goal of the project is to use this variation among people to look specifically at towards the details of the distribution, and through a series of questionnaires and then imaging protocols to get an understanding of the architecture and correlates of religious cognition in those two groups. And this will tell us, I think it may be for the first time, or one of the first times, it will tell us something about the variation among humans in the nature of religious cognition through a systematic and controlled study. I mean, there's a certain tendency to think that the brain works, kind of the same in everybody, and a certain region does the same things in everyone. But I think one can also make a case that there is considerable so-called neurodiversity, neurocognition, and that diversity extends well into the realm of religiosity. So we're looking at a set of aspects of religiosity that include the perceived agency of religious figures and supernatural figures and human figures and inanimate objects, degree of agency, degree of theory of mind, how much mind do each of these types of entity have, where does morality come from? Does morality come from religion and God? Does it come from some sort of supernatural phenomenon? Does it come from humans? And then also attachment, because attachment to other humans is of key importance in the development of social cognition, and certainly also in terms of attachment to gods and God figures. So we have a set of imaging tasks that are designed to determine what regions of the brain are differentially activated under the prompts that are related to agency, theory of mind, morality, and attachment. And we want to see, are there patterns of differences between our two groups, autism and positive schizotypy, and what are they? I mean, there are certain expectations, there are certainly certain predictions one can make from the existing literature on religiosity in people with autism or people with schizophrenia. But the literature that does exist is very sketchy and scattered, and there's not very much in the way of data. And then that imaging work is designed to dovetail with questionnaire work, where we actually ask people about agency and theory of mind and morality and attachment, and then we can do things like compare, what they said in the questionnaire with what their brain said, which is often something different in humans. Those are the sort of the overarching goals of the work, to use this full range of variation to say, well, what is the diversity of cognition in humans, and how does it relate to the relevant brain regions?
Is the default hypothesis that since people in the schizotypal region or end of the distribution tend to hypermentalize, while the ASD individuals tend to hypomentalize, at least in some respects, that you'll get more sort of religiosity, or at least cognitions about supernatural agents maybe, or certain type of supernatural agents with the schizotypals versus the ASD individuals?
Right, that is certainly one of the main expectations. Mentalizing is an important part of the picture. It's just part of the picture, though. I mean, the full package also involves aspects of morality and attachment, and we don't know very much, really. I mean, we know some about how those tend to differ in people along a spectrum from autism to typical to schizotypal, but we don't know much about that. And then the question is, are there certain combinations of, say, morality, belief in morality coming from gods or coming from humans, for example, that might be quite important in the degree to which autistic type people and schizotypal type people consider themselves religious, or what religiosity actually means to them. I mean, so, for example, we might expect utilitarian sorts of moral judgments in people on the autism spectrum. And we might expect differences in forms of attachment, so reduced attachment. And this could lead people on the autism spectrum to a more physical world and a less mental world conception of religiosity, almost a conception based in physics or cosmology that doesn't have a sort of a human type figure at the center, but has some order. Yeah, sort of the ultimate in systemizing and the order of
speaking of, sorry to interrupt, Bernie. Speaking of systematizing, the old Baron Cohen theory of ASD individuals tend to exemplify the quote unquote male brain, and the schizotypal tend to exemplify female brain. Do you put any stock in that? And if so, what are the implications of that for this study and for religiosity, if any? There may not be any, I don't know.
Well, there's certainly something to it. I mean, it does have predictive power, and in our data, we have pretty much always seen the sort of male brain effects, at least in some of the subscales of the autism spectrum, and we see a consistent female bias in terms of positive schizotypy. The whole male-female dimension is quite important, given the female bias in religiosity, and
Yes.
the question where that comes from. I mean, females do tend, generally to have better mentalistic skills, and the question would be, well, better theory of mind as well, for example, on the reading the mind in the eyes tests. They would also be expected to have different perceptions related to morality and attachment. So I think, to the extent that it is possible to partition out the male-female differences, I think that whole approach of looking at, empathizing, which is kind of a form of mentalizing, would be important in understanding that dimension of the diversity. But there could easily be other factors that would be centrally involved.
Can I ask one more introductory question, and then I'll turn it over to Jordan for a few questions. One fascinating aspect of your work on this particular project for me is the extent to which, if any, you feel that it contacts your earlier work in the human sciences, let's say, your diametric theory with about schizophrenia. Does it contact that theory at all? Is there any linkages there?
Well, there's very, very strong links. I mean, that
I would think
theory,
so. Yeah.
in its broadest form, is that these are diametrical disorders that define the ends of a spectrum in social cognition, and as such, it situates the disorders in new ways with respect to one another. And then within that theory, there is the whole issue of genomic imprinting and genomic conflict, and the interests of maternally expressed genes versus paternally expressed genes. And that part of the theory is certainly connected to aspects of religiosity, especially in terms of maternal inculcation of morality and religion into children. Because this is something that would be probably quite effective in terms of serving maternal interests. And then the paternal genes, they sort of have the more quote unquote selfish effects, both physically and psychologically. So people more on that side of the spectrum would be expected to be less amenable to being sort of enculturated into sociality. It's a little hard to get a handle on the imprinted gene effects. One could try to do it by looking at effects of particular candidate genes on particular, say, religion-related variables. I mean, we've done some of that with imprinted genes in the Prader-Willi region, and we found one locus that was linked to paranoia quite closely, for example. So is the locus that's, linked to, easy inculcation of children. That would be very useful for mothers.
What about the older work on genomic imprinting effects on neocortical sites versus subcortical sites in mouse brains? Has that been advanced at all?
Right, that's Barry Cavern's work from
Barry Cavern's,
quite a while back.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything since.
Well, there's nothing that's really followed it up directly to speak of. I mean, there has been some work that is related to that. The Cavern work was kind of general, and it sort of referred to this sort of whole category of genes that were either androgenic or maternally derived. So it hasn't really been followed up. I think it would. I mean, it could be followed up in terms of, for example, looking at mouse mutants for particular imprinted genes and looking at effects on brain development from perturbation of those imprinted genes.
But he had argued that maternally expressed genes help sculpt what he called the social brain. And that would have direct implications for religiosity. But as you just said, it hasn't been followed up, and I want to turn things over to Jordan for a few questions.
Just one question to start with. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about attachment to God in the case where somebody might not be able to fully understand God's intentions. So we've seen some studies that show there's a close relationship between attachment to God and your ability to sort of see God's intentions. So in the case of, and I assume we're talking here about, let's for the person that tunes into you here, in the case of autism, are we talking about adults rather than children? Or are we talking about children and adolescents too? To start,
we were talking mainly about adolescents, but also people who are somewhat older than that, say in their 20s, in terms of this work.
So if we understand correctly that at least some of your participants who are in the AS and the autism spectrum disorder range are not going to do very well on tasks related to understanding someone else's intention, and let's make the assumption that could include a sense of God and God's acts, then how do you think, or what do you think might then be the factor or factors that would still allow them to be attached to an idea of God?
Well, I think the idea of God would have to be a different one. It would have to be one that was less human and more physical, even though potentially the physical or cosmological idea there would have meaning in the same way that a connection to a God or another person has meaning. So people with autism then could be connected to the idea that there is order in the universe. There are rules that govern the universe, and that beauty and order, and what we don't understand in the content in terms of where it comes from, that would be kind of a God equivalent. It's one thing to talk about this, but I almost wonder if it's something that might be rather difficult to understand unless one was one of those people who had that sort of viewpoint. But I mean, absolutely, the question of attachment is a bit unclear with regard to people with autism. There has been some work on that, and it doesn't really show a clear lack of attachment. It's almost as though attachment doesn't really apply in the same way. Sometimes there is some sort of an attachment to the mother that is a unique sort of attachment that could be based on, getting what you want from the mother more than anything else. But then attachment beyond that, I mean, that's what Tanner said. That Tanner talked about affective contact as being the major psychological factor that was missing. And with that contact, well, you're not going to connect with or necessarily trust or believe in any sort of human godlike figure, because you don't see them as being sort of a real entity or a reliable entity, and that could result in distrustfulness and so on.
In the case of your schizotypal patients, participants, it's probably likely that they're going to have a little bit more reports of magical ideation, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And do you think that then might help promote their religiosity?
Well, yes, I would certainly see it as one of the core aspects. It might be a precondition. It might be a necessary condition. I don't know if I'd see it as a sufficient condition, because I think that to have religiosity, one needs something beyond magical thinking, something that has aspects of morality and attachment that are mixed in there with the magical thinking. We had a family friend who was a lovely woman who believed in fairies. She would tell us about the fairies she had seen and so on, and she was lovely. I don't think she was really religious to speak of, though. So I would see it more as a necessary condition, but as the sufficient ones, I don't know. I'd say some combination there, but I really, at this point, it's a little hard to speak to what that combination would be.
So in both of these, in all these cases that you're mentioning, maybe in some aspects, there might be family histories. So if somebody is an ASD participant, it's possible their parents, for example, maybe one parent, or back in their family history, there might be somebody, and the same for schizotypal participants, right? So there may be a family history of schizophrenia or some related disorder, say. So in that case, the participants are being raised already in a certain kind of context. And I'm wondering if you think that you'll be able to look at that in your studies at all to see if that influences how somebody's religiosity developed.
Right. That should be in. There should be information about that in some of the questionnaires. Certainly, it's sort of the, did you go to church? Did you were required to go to church, and so on. I don't know if we got information on psychiatric family histories there, but I mean, it's that the whole question that you raise is a really key one that has, I think, been largely overlooked for historical reasons, and that goes back to Bettelheim. This doctor named Bettelheim who tried to convince everyone that autism was caused by cold-hearted mothers, so-called refrigerator mothers, and sort of to blame the parents, basically. And that was really quite a terrible episode in the field. And there was a very, very strong reaction against that. And now bringing up anything that might be related to the parents having an effect is quite strongly frowned upon. But for something like religiosity, it's got to be important, especially for the mother. So the degree to which the mother is relatively autistic or relatively schizotypal is going to be very important. And it's an interactive effect between the mother and the kid, their psychologies, in terms of what you end up with.
So to go off a little bit, I was wondering about your interest in religiosity. I wonder if the viewer might be interested in what led you, since there are not so many people doing studies in this area, right? What sort of led you into these kinds of studies? What motivated you?
Well, I was raised academically by a couple of people who worked with human social evolution, Bill Hamilton and Richard Alexander, who were really focused on understanding human evolution. And if you look at human evolution, you're always looking for what is unusual, what makes humans stand apart, what makes them unique. And religiosity is really one of the biggest there, and it could be quite fundamentally important in various ways in all sorts of aspects of human evolution, in terms of the evolution of cooperation within groups and conflict between groups, and the evolution of aspects of human cognition. It's puzzling, because on one hand we have the evolution of higher intelligence and rationality and tools and logic as sort of the main theme that has made humans humans. But then on the other hand, we've got these beliefs that are not grounded in observable reality, and so these would appear to be kind of opposites in conflict to one another, but somehow they can work together in the brain. So I'm very curious about the role that it plays in human evolution. I was raised a good Catholic boy in Illinois. My mother had 8 kids, and then they got a letter from the bishop saying that they could stop then, because they had done their bit, as Prince Philip said. So I had a lot of exposure to Catholic religiosity, and it really stuck in half of my siblings. It really stuck, and in the other half it didn't. And I found that absolutely puzzling. It almost made me think that there really was the God gene, VMAT2 was really out there. I don't believe that at all, but it made me think that, well, maybe there's got to be some gene environment interaction effect going on, perhaps. And probably early in development, there's some critical period where it sticks in some people and it doesn't stick in other people. But what is that? People don't know.
I think the imprinting story may have a major contribution here, in terms of what genes might influence development of religiosity, and indeed the evolution of religiosity. So I think that holds great promise. And I see that we're coming up to the half hour, so I have one last question, if I may. Again, this is more speculative, but there's been a lot of work done, in fact, by evolutionary anthropologists on, particularly Whitehead's group up in Belfast in Ireland, that there are two modes of religiosity, generally speaking. If you look, across many cultures, many individuals, there's a doctrinal mode that's very moralistic, emphasis on doctrine and all that kind of stuff, and abstract concepts, loyalty, in-group loyalty, stuff like that. And then there's a imagistic mode that's all about pageantry, initiation rites. One's based on semantic memory, the other one's on episodic memory, and so forth. And this is backed up by reams of data, again, cross-cultural stuff, and thousands of individuals interviewed and surveyed and all of. So it's got good empirical basis to it, these two modes. And now we're talking about ASD versus schizotypal individuals, and they tend towards these ideal male versus female brains. And I'm wondering, to what extent could those two modes of religiosity be based, in these diametrically opposed ideal types?
Right. I think Alexander once said to me that he thought that predators were motivated by pleasure and herbivores were motivated by pain, in terms of avoiding pain. So, and then in terms of social behavior, if you have a conflict of interest, then you can either settle it to be one party providing benefits to the other, or some sort of coercion. Now, the doctrinaire aspects of religion seem to be based on fear and power. It seems to me that the other side, the
majestic.
Yeah, the majestic, and in turn, they go into the cathedral, and the height of the cathedral gives you a big dopamine hit, and you get the music coming and the beautiful colors and so on. That's really providing people with a sort of transcendent, pleasurable sort of experience. So that's what those dimensions look like, in general, to me. Those would essentially be two complementary ways of having a religious institution provide to people what is sort of required for the people to be happy, and the institution to be sort of in control. We would tend to expect people on sort of the autism spectrum to, potentially in part tend to react against forms of control, but then people on the more maternal side would be indoctrinated relatively easily and more cooperative. So I could see it fitting in that way.
That's really amazing. That's really fascinating. Huh. Well, that's great. That's it for me. Jordan, any further questions from?
No, I just like to thank you for participating in our project. It increases the value of what we're doing by a lot, and I'm hoping as the projects continue, we learn from you and what your findings are to help us think more deeply about the importance of the brain representation of religious beliefs. It's certainly an environment we can explore more easily than the cosmos. So thanks again for everything you're doing. We really appreciate it.
I think we learn not only about brain aspects of religiosity, but perhaps it's evolutionary roots as well with this kind of work. So,
Yeah.
so thanks again.
Well, thank you for the funding and for the opportunity to do the work and for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today.
It's been great. Thanks again, Chanel. Thanks, everybody. See you later.
Bye.